Hello, my dear viewers. It's Helen here as always, and today on the channel, I have two chilling true crime stories for you. Sometimes a nightmare can be lurking right in your own home. So, let's start with the first story. On the morning of August 12, 2005, at 9 o'clock, the Siacho police station in Seoul received an urgent call from a woman. She was calling from an office building, and her voice, pleading for help, was extremely distressing. They were groans filled with pain. She could barely speak. The police, sensing the seriousness of the situation, quickly rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found two women lying on the floor. One of them was presumably the caller. The victims were 19-year-old resident of the office building, Miss Kim, and her friend, as well as the caller, Miss Hwan. Unfortunately, Miss Kim was already dead, and Miss Hwan was severely injured and immediately taken to the hospital. The situation was so critical that the police had difficulty understanding what had happened right away. Then the on-site investigation began. The body of the deceased Miss Kim showed signs of strangulation with a thin rope, while Miss Hwan had been stabbed. However, upon inspecting the premises, the police noticed something strange. Despite one woman being severely injured and the other murdered, the apartment was surprisingly clean, as if the perpetrator had meticulously cleaned up after themselves. No hairs or suspected murder weapons, including the rope, were found. Even some of the bedding was completely missing. In other words, the perpetrator had erased all traces of themselves. However, there was one piece of evidence. Male DNA was found on Miss Kim's body. The police immediately sent the samples for genetic testing and simultaneously began questioning the residents of the office building. It should be noted that the office building, located in the Gangnam Seochodong area, was well secured. During the crime, nothing suspicious was noticed in the common areas of the building. Moreover, there were no signs of forced entry into Miss Kim's apartment, and nothing valuable was missing. Thus, the police concluded that the perpetrator was somehow connected to Miss Kim. The police were particularly intrigued by the complex multi-digit lock on the door. This indicated that the perpetrator was well acquainted with the security systems of this office building. Consequently, the police decided that the perpetrator might be one of the residents of the building and began questioning all the tenants. In this office building, about 1,000 people lived. However, as is often the case in such buildings, people didn't always know who lived next to them or what was happening in the neighboring apartments. Many of the residents were young people who moved frequently and didn't have close relationships with their neighbors. When the police began their investigation and set up cordons around the building, the residents started to realize that a murder had occurred, and the news quickly spread throughout the building. However, the residents did not show much willingness to cooperate with the police and even expressed displeasure at being suspected of involvement in the crime. In such conditions, interviewing each resident was difficult, but the police continued their work despite the challenges. Nevertheless, there was one person among the residents who attracted special attention from the police: the victim's friend, Miss Hwan, who was severely injured and could become a key witness. After Miss Hwan called the police, she lost consciousness and couldn't give a statement for a long time. Fortunately, she regained consciousness during treatment in the hospital and was able to tell the police what had happened that night. Miss Hwan, originally from Busan, had come to Seoul on business and decided to stay for one night at her friend Miss Kim's place, with whom she had been friends since school. That evening, they talked for a long time, reminiscing about old times, and went to sleep in the same bed. During the night, Miss Hwan was awakened by a strange noise and noticed an unfamiliar man in the room. She tried not to make any noise, but the man saw her and raised a kitchen knife. He stabbed her several times in the back, after which she lost consciousness. About 3 hours later, Miss Huan regained consciousness and saw that her friend Miss Kim was lying dead next to her. Summoning her last strength, she called the police and lost consciousness again. Miss Huan described the attacker as a man in his late 20s to early 30s, about 170 centimeters tall, of average build, with a round face, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and red sneakers. The police were stunned because this description reminded them of Miss Kim's neighbor, whom they were already suspecting. The next step was to compare the DNA found on Miss Kim's body with that of the neighbor. The police needed the suspect's DNA. They went back to the neighbor, and unexpectedly, he showed a great willingness to cooperate. The police took a mouth swab for DNA analysis and sent it to the National Forensic Lab. The results left no doubt. The DNA was a 100% match. The suspect, An, was immediately arrested, which happened a week after the crime. However, despite the DNA match, An denied his guilt. In these circumstances, the police needed Ms. Huan's help once again. She had to identify the suspect, and she confirmed that he was indeed the attacker. 5 days after his arrest, An confessed to the crime. The story unfolded as follows. At the time of the crime, neighbor An was unemployed, having recently left his 6th advertising company. He was 28 years old and frequently changed jobs. This time, he had not lasted even 6 months before quitting, experiencing severe stress. One manifestation of this stress was insomnia, and he often went out at night to smoke. On one of these nights, An stood by his front door to make sure the lock clicked, as his apartment door often didn't close properly. At that moment, he heard strange sounds coming from Miss Kim's apartment, the moans of a man and a woman, and remembered Miss Kim, whom he often noticed before, although they were not acquainted. He liked her and frequently paid attention to her. The night sounds from her apartment aroused his curiosity, and he approached her door to listen. At that time, Miss Kim was preparing for her wedding, scheduled for December, and her fiancé visited her every night, spending time with her until early morning and then returning home. Over time, neighbor An started noticing this routine. He would smoke by her door and eavesdrop on their conversations and sounds until he realized that around 4 in the morning, her fiancé would leave, leaving Miss Kim alone. This knowledge eventually led to the tragic events. At dawn, at 5:30 in the morning, An went out to the landing to smoke again. As usual, he headed toward Miss Kim's apartment door. But on that day, he had an overwhelming urge to try opening her door. Perhaps he hoped she would be alone and he could carry out his vile intentions. To his surprise and horror, the door opened easily. It turned out that Miss Kim's apartment door had the same locking issues as his own, and that night the lock hadn't worked properly. And cautiously entered Miss Kim's apartment, intending to carry out his malicious plans. However, inside he encountered an unexpected situation. Miss Kim's friend, Miss Huan, was sleeping next to her. The noise woke Miss Huan, and An, panicking, grabbed a knife from the kitchen and began mercilessly attacking her. He thought he had killed her and pushed her body under the bed, where it made muffled sounds. This noise woke Miss Kim, and then brutally raped her multiple times. Each time he finished, he forced her to go to the bathroom and wash thoroughly to remove any traces. During this horrific period, Miss Kim, crying, begged him for mercy, saying that she was soon to be married and would do anything he wanted if only he would spare her life. But An ignored her pleas. He believed that to avoid detection, he needed to kill Miss Kim, just as he thought he had killed Miss Huan. After completing the rapes, he tied Miss Kim and strangled her with a rope. This was a heinous crime committed by a 28-year-old man with no previous criminal record. Afterward, and meticulously cleaned up the crime scene, he removed the tape from the victim's hands and feet, collected hairs, and cut out parts of the bedding where his traces might have been left. This was a horrific act of violence and brutality that shocked the public and caused widespread outrage. The knife Anne used to attack Miss Juan was hidden in a bag and thrown into the Han River. He hoped that by doing this he could hide the evidence and commit the perfect crime. Once calm, he returned home and continued his usual routine, even attending an interview for a new job. When the police first came to him, his calm and indifferent behavior aroused their suspicions. Despite all his attempts to remove the evidence, traces of his DNA were left on the victim's body. Anne was arrested and charged with murder and other serious crimes. In court, he tried to justify himself, saying he was under stress from being fired and that his actions were spontaneous due to his youth and strong sexual urges. But his arguments were unconvincing. The court found him guilty, considering the meticulously planned crime and his cold-blooded actions in eliminating the evidence. The court sentenced Anne to life imprisonment, noting that his crime was especially brutal and premeditated. The judge stated that despite his claims, the crime was committed with the clear intent to kill and rape. Thus, Anne was sentenced to life in prison, and he is still serving his sentence. His actions led to the tragic death of Miss Kim, who was preparing for her wedding and the start of a new family, while her friend Miss Juan was left with physical and psychological scars for life. This case, which occurred in the very heart of Seoul in the safe district of Gangnam, reminded everyone that crimes can happen anywhere. For women living alone, it is very important to be cautious and to check the locks on their doors thoroughly. When your parents talk about it, it might seem like mere nagging, but it's really important. It is a minimal protection that can keep you safe. May Miss Kim, who was so unjustly taken from this world, rest in peace. And may Miss Juan, who survived this terrible incident, find the strength to overcome her pain and return to a normal life. On September 22, 2018, around 4 p.m., a young girl named Choi was walking home through an alley in the Nokyeongdong area of Uijeongbu, Gyeonggi Province. Choi, a 14-year-old second-year middle school student, lived on the third floor of an apartment building in that alley. She returned home at about 4:20 p.m. and immediately turned on her computer. She planned to chat with her friends through an online messenger. After a brief exchange of messages, she left home 10 minutes later, leaving her computer on. She went to the hair salon directly across the street to get her long bangs trimmed. She returned home at 5:24 p.m. However, on her way back, a strange man started following her. He kept watching her, and soon Choi noticed him too. The man quickly pulled out a knife and entered the building with Choi. He dragged her into a room. About 20 minutes later, at 5:45 p.m., Choi's mother, who had been in the bathroom, came home. She noticed her daughter's shoes at the entrance, but the house was unusually quiet. Thinking that Choi might have fallen asleep, she called out to her but received no response. Sensing something was wrong, she took off her shoes in the hallway and headed toward the living room. At that moment, the door to Choi's room opened and the stranger appeared. He looked to be about 30-40 years old and appeared pale. The man calmly walked out of Choi's room. Choi's mother stood frozen in horror and shock at the entrance, unable to move. The man walked past the mother, opened the front door, and calmly stepped outside as if he were leaving his own home. At that moment, the mother was trying to understand what was happening, and then, realizing the danger, she screamed and ran after him. She chased him to the door on the first floor, but the perpetrator quickly disappeared. Looking back at her home, she saw Choi, staggering out of the hallway. The mother quickly rushed back upstairs and Choi Yeon collapsed into her arms. Shortly after, emergency responders arrived and urgently took Choi to the hospital, but she passed away 3 hours later. When she was found, Choi was fully dressed and bleeding from her left chest. An autopsy revealed that she had been stabbed once in the left chest, with a wound approximately 13 centimeters deep. One of the cuts, about 3 centimeters deep, had pierced her heart, leading to her rapid death. But there was more. Traces of semen were found in Choi Yeon's body, indicating that she had been raped. Traces may have been left behind. Let's examine the crime scene. Inside, there were no fingerprints or traces of the perpetrator. The police found no stolen items or signs of forced entry and determined that Choi had been stabbed only once. Based on this information, the police concluded that the primary motive of the crime was rape. The perpetrator had followed Choi into her home with the intent to commit rape, but was interrupted when her mother returned home unexpectedly 10 minutes later. Panicking, he impulsively killed Choi. However, there are other opinions. Some believe that the perpetrator initially broke into the house intending to rob it, but then changed his mind and attempted only the rape before fleeing. In any case, the top priority is to catch the perpetrator. The police have deployed about 60 detectives and are seeking witnesses to create a composite sketch of the criminal. Fortunately, during the examination of the crime scene, they managed to collect pubic hair from the suspect. This could be a crucial piece of evidence. Through DNA analysis, it was established that the perpetrator has blood type B. Following this, the police conducted a DNA comparison with several hundred individuals who had committed similar crimes in the same area. Despite the extensive investigation, no matches were found. Let's analyze the perpetrator more closely. He abducted Choi in broad daylight around 5 p.m. and brought her home. After committing the crime, he encountered the mother, simply walked past her, and left. This might seem like a bold and skillful crime, suggesting that the perpetrator might have a criminal record. However, looking at the situation from another perspective, his actions were rather reckless and hasty. If he were a professional criminal, he would likely have studied who was at home, when they returned, and so on, before committing the crime. It's particularly important to note that if the perpetrator had a criminal record, he might have attacked Choi's mother as well to eliminate a witness, knowing that he could be easily identified and arrested. Thus, while his actions appear bold, they were not meticulous or well thought out. The crime was indeed audacious, leading experts to conclude that it is highly likely that this was the perpetrator's first crime. Sometime later, the police obtained surveillance footage from a camera installed near Choi Yeon's home at a nearby bakery. The camera was set up to monitor illegal parking, and it accidentally captured the perpetrator. The video showed him limping as he fled. This was a crucial piece of evidence, but unfortunately the quality of the recording was poor, making it impossible to clearly identify the perpetrator's face. Nevertheless, the police had an advantage. They had the testimonies of 3 witnesses who saw the fleeing perpetrator, including Choi Yeon's mother. One of the witnesses was a local resident who was collecting paper near Choi Yeon's home. He saw a man calmly descending the stairs in the apartment building and then running away after exiting. This struck him as strange, and shortly afterward, the mother came running out. Another witness was a local vendor who saw a man adjusting his pants as he walked. The vendor stated that this seemed very odd. Thus, the police had 3 witnesses who saw the perpetrator, but there was another problem. None of them could clearly remember the perpetrator's face. Moreover, their testimonies were inconsistent and only complicated the investigation. One of the witnesses even pointed to a foreign worker from Myanmar who lived nearby as a potential suspect. However, DNA analysis showed that he was not involved. The police placed great hope on Choi Yeon's mother, who had directly confronted the perpetrator. However, she was so traumatized that she couldn't clearly remember his face. In an effort to find her daughter's killer, she agreed to undergo a hypnotic interview, and finally, a composite sketch of the perpetrator was created. With renewed confidence, the police launched a public investigation and distributed flyers with the composite sketch. However, it turned out that this composite sketch differed significantly from the face described by other witnesses. This indicated that the sketch might be inaccurate, as it was based solely on the mother's recollections. Before distributing the sketch, the police should have discussed it with the other witnesses and conducted a confirmation procedure to ensure the accuracy of the image. However, the police skipped this step. When it was discovered that the sketch might be incorrect, there were concerns that it could confuse the investigation. This situation was reminiscent of a case in 1997 involving the murder of Park Chorong Binari, where the police also created an inaccurate composite sketch of the perpetrator, which hindered the prevention of Park's death. Forensic experts note that an inaccurate composite sketch can create bias and obstruct the capture of the real criminal. The investigation continued facing difficulties. The motive for the crime remained unclear, there was insufficient evidence, and the composite sketch proved unreliable, complicating the search for the suspect. Eventually, after 50 days of investigation, the task force was disbanded, and the case shifted to a long-term investigation mode. Meanwhile, Choi Yeon's mother grew increasingly anxious over the prolonged investigation. Ultimately, she decided to undergo another hypnosis session at her own expense. During the second session, an updated composite sketch was created, which looks like this. According to surveillance footage, the suspect was of slender build, approximately 170 to 175 centimeters tall, and between 35 to 45 years old. At the time of the crime, he was wearing a white short-sleeved t-shirt, a cream-colored vest, and black pants. The footage showed him limping, but it was unclear whether this was due to a physical injury or if he was doing it deliberately to mislead. Perhaps it seemed like he was limping because he was pulling up his pants while fleeing after the assault. The most reliable information that the investigation managed to establish was the perpetrator's blood type, B. However, the investigation still held onto hope. Based on the slender build and dark skin tone, forensic experts speculated that the perpetrator might be a manual laborer. Additionally, the crime occurred around 4:30 in the evening, which could also provide additional clues. It was presumed that he was someone who either didn't work at that hour or didn't have a steady job, meaning he could have been a temporary worker. The perpetrator did not hide his face, so people familiar with him were excluded from the list of suspects. The fact that the crime occurred in the Nokyeongdong area of Uijeongbu suggested that the perpetrator was likely familiar with the area. Furthermore, the residential neighborhood was quite intricate, and it would have been easy for someone unfamiliar with the locality to get lost. It's possible that the perpetrator had been in the vicinity and watching the victim for a long time, and on the day of the crime, he noticed she was home alone and decided to strike. The entire crime took only 20 minutes. The small amount of semen found indicated that the perpetrator might have attempted the rape, the crime might have been spontaneous, and the murder was committed impulsively. However, this raises another question. Why did he have a knife with him? If this was a spontaneous crime, why was he armed? If it had been a spontaneous crime, there wouldn't have been a need to carry a knife. Perhaps the perpetrator was prepared in advance for the possibility of encountering someone and killing them. This suggests a possible premeditated intent to kill. This is indeed a complex case. The perpetrator could have acted in various ways, and everything I say is merely speculation and analysis. It's a very challenging case where even cause and effect relationships are hard to pinpoint accurately. Since the statute of limitations for this case was lifted, the investigation has been resumed by the police in the northern part of Gyeonggi Province. The key piece of evidence remains the DNA collected from the crime scene. The investigative team has expanded the pool of potential suspects nationwide, broadened the search area, and is using various investigative methods to find the perpetrator. These efforts are commendable. However, the police's approach to the investigation has also faced criticism. It seems the police believe they can catch the perpetrator only if he commits a similar crime again and his DNA matches the existing sample. Is it necessary to wait for another victim to catch the perpetrator? In fact, the investigation should continue diligently without waiting for such an event. During the investigation, another misunderstanding occurred. Choi Yan's mother once noticed a man in the area who closely resembled the perpetrator. She immediately called the detective in charge, but he told her to call the emergency services number 112. Was this really the best advice for a grieving mother who had lost her daughter? After the tragedy, Choi Yan's parents couldn't leave the area where the incident occurred. They feared the perpetrator might return for revenge since the mother had seen his face. They even temporarily moved away but returned to seek justice for their daughter. In interviews, they expressed their fear that people might forget about the unjust death of their daughter. According to statistics from 2018, an average of 80 sexual crimes are committed daily in South Korea, which amounts to 3 cases per hour. More recent data from 2021 shows that 95% of all violent crimes in the country are sexual offenses. The rising number of such crimes is particularly alarming. While punishments for sexual crimes in South Korea are known to be harsher than for many other types of crimes, it did not save 14-year-old Choi Yeon, who was forced to leave this world in such a painful manner. To not only achieve justice for her but also to prevent similar tragedies in the future, the efforts of the investigative team and any information from witnesses are urgently needed.